So anyway, we see, I don't know, kind of that progression from biblical times to now. There is a connection, but things have changed so much. A lot of times in response to the context around,
Hmm.
what's happening around
Yeah, and I don't know
the
if
church.
before we've even mentioned the way that the church has gone from classic liturgy to the newer version of concert. Speech.
He wants to give you your emotional focus back.
It seems that that's at least perceived to keep people's attention, or will keep people coming. Is
To be relevant, most of the reason. Yeah.
Yeah, and the growth with that, because I remember being 11. We had a small music team that was a snare drum. Like the singer had a banjo, probably, and then there was an acoustic guitar. It was just those three things, and then we had the
Nice.
yeah, and then you had the praise book, and they would sing things like, I could sing of your love forever, and
Okay.
at the time that was a newish song. So I think that song
Yeah.
was 90s. If
I think, yeah, I think so.
the songs like that I really still like, and like then, and then
Sure.
now you have a lot of the big churches, the big influential churches that really took over the Christian sphere, that have a lot of live electronics and things like that. So it's, when you talk about the organ being a newfangled thing, and we're just so far removed from that being the newfangled thing. You've got people with live pitch correct, and six singers to harmonize while all having the pitch correction, and then yeah, you have a few synths going on, and you
Sure.
got your guy running just the MacBook, so just the samples are going on, and it almost seems like, yeah, they're singing, I guess, about God, but it's just not worship at the same time,
Hmm.
because there's seemingly no effort into it. I don't know, what do you think about, I guess, worship music versus worshiping God? Is there
Yeah.
anything
Yeah.
there?
Yeah. And just to be clear, there definitely can be overlap.
Mm-hmm.
You can the singing that someone engages in on a Sunday absolutely can be worship, but it's not all worship. And I
Yes.
definitely think it does a disservice for us to continue to reference it as just worship. Now we're going to do worship. It would be like, please use, like, now we're getting into the music ministry or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Such a better idea. It's so much better for the everyday person in the pews trying to understand what's going on. I do think that knowing a little bit about how it developed, like this current Christian pop scene,
Mm-hmm.
is helpful. And so I'll describe it real quickly, and just like as few sentences as possible, because a lot of people haven't thought about this. It's like, how did we get to the place where we have 45 minutes of music and also a
Mm-hmm.
concert atmosphere
Yeah.
in our Sunday morning church service? And then we have the sermon, but then that band comes back up for another 15 minutes or so,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like they have to be there for that altar call to be effective,
Yeah,
or
I was
something like
I
that.
was thinking about the altar call just quick before you start, and how
Yeah.
it's the music is in such the music and concert atmosphere is so front and center. It seems more so than the message, or more so than God himself. It's almost insinuated that if you are in your seat while these people are performing, you are not spiritual, or you're not a Christian, or you're having a bad day. If you're still sitting, or if you don't leave your seat and rush to the front like you would to see.
And it is, of course, that's the parallels that people do need to take note of. Is, yes, the getting out of your seat and going forward is something that's from secular concerts initially, and also the raising of hands as well, right? That happens at concerts. And again, I'm someone who raises my hands, but I just, just being honest about the development of that. It's not
Hmm.
like, well, Paul said, I request that men pray with their hands raised in, it's either First or Second Timothy, that's what we're doing
Sure.
in the Christian rock concert Sunday service. No, that there's a direct line of hand raising in between those two, that they're the same thing. They're not the same thing, but it doesn't mean that it's bad. It just, we should know what we're doing and be thoughtful about it.
Hmm.
But anyway, just real quick, in the 1900s, you eventually have, there's all these changes, obviously gigantic technological changes. You have like the invention of the radio, right? And not long after the invention of the radio, you have obviously music coming through it. And then you have this burgeoning music industry, obviously, because now you have the consumers. And I'm just going to like fast forward to when like the Christian
Sure.
parallel comes. So you have the 60s and the 70s counterculture, and the music that's coming up, and music that I like very much today because I had to listen to a bunch when I was a kid, the oldie stations that my parents had listening. And at first I was like, man, when this is this, but then you get used to it, and then it's nostalgic. And yes, so America and
The Eagles.
the Beatles, the Eagles. Oh yeah, all of the monkeys, all of the different animals, the turtles. Come on, but anyway, so you have that music, and it's dominant. It's the young people are loving it, consuming it.
Hmm.
And of course, there are some young people who are Christians. There are some young people that like this music, but they want to worship God with this music. Hey, that's fine. That's a good thing. And so you end up getting what eventually will be known as contemporary Christian music, CCM.
Hmm.
So it explodes in the 60s, especially in California, very much with the guy who founded Calvary Chapel, Chuck Smith.
Sure.
He was very influential with this in funding some of the first albums. And his label, I guess, eventually was Maranatha. And yeah, so that just became popular, more and more popular, and its popularity spread. And eventually, these young people grew up, and they
Hmm.
came to the age where they were leaders in the church. And,
Yeah.
and basically, once you get more people who grew up listening to this music and worshiping God with this music, the more and more those people said, hey, let's use this on a Sunday service.
Hmm.
And so kind of a slow progression, but it was parallel to the development of secular pop music. It's
Hmm.
pretty much the same thing, but a Christian version. And of course, when you're singing that rather than just hymns, well, that music is played not just with a piano, not just with an
Yeah.
organ. It may not even be played with those at all. There's a guitar, there's drums, there's a bass guitar. And so those instruments end up coming into the church on the Sunday worship service. And eventually, and that music too, it's not really played in a church, it's played in a concert
Yeah.
hall. And so newer churches that are being built begin to look more like concert halls on the inside. And it's kind of just this, it makes a lot of sense. The progression into what it is today. And of course, it's not all churches, but there are a lot where it's seeking to be like a concert atmosphere.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is based upon the music that change happened.
Yeah. Some of them just look like concert halls. Some of them look like even just VFW halls. They don't look like your traditional church. And then you get into the conversation of, traditionalism, and we're not traditionalists and everything. But when there's no kind of visual reminders that you're in a church, not that God can't occupy that, but I think you have this responsibility to create a certain atmosphere, and music, and a lot of it can be contemporary Christian music can be kind of atmospheric now, especially with the use of
Sure.
electronics.
Oh, yeah.
But just then you look around and it's all gray walls, or it's very plain, or it's all the focus is on the stage and nothing else. It just can be
Sure.
kind of problematic in that way, because it does take the attention off of God and onto the person.
Yeah, and you mentioned tradition, and so just to say something real quick about that is for people to remember, if you go to a church that's like a concert, that's a tradition. There's nowhere in Scripture that commands that. It's actually just as traditional as, let's say, a highly liturgical service. It's just, I don't know, like you don't think it's traditional, but it is. So it's kind of, and that's one thing that started to kind of turn me into the liturgical direction is that, well, this tradition, admits that it has tradition, and
Mm-hmm.
it's thoughtful, it's purposeful. A lot of it's symbolic of certain scriptural things.
Sure.
But in the tradition that I was in, it's like we deny we're traditional and we act like it's just me and Jesus or just me and scripture, when it's just that our tradition is 30 or 40 years old in certain things rather
Mm-hmm.
than 1500 or 1800
Yeah.
years old in certain things. But yes, so it has changed the space that we worship in, definitely. And so that's the question. This this change that's occurred and what we see, is it, a good thing? Is it problematic, or is it no big deal at all? We do know that, like, primarily, like, why has these changes occurred? First of all, a lot of these changes occurred slowly.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't any human being that, like, they had let's say it was like a Lutheran church that practiced the liturgy, and then, like, one pastor was like, we're now going to be doing a concert, like, next month we're starting it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there probably are a couple of examples of people doing that. I bet it didn't work out well, but generally all of these things happened over years and years. There's so many Christian leaders today that have no clue about, like, that change. Like, growing up, it was concerty,
Mm-hmm.
maybe not as atmospheric, but it was still 45 minutes of music with a band followed by a 45-minute message.
Mm-hmm.
They grew up with that. Now they're doing that. Now it's just darker, and there's, like, crazy colored lights, and their band is
Fog
better,
machine.
and their jeans are tighter when they're preaching, and their guns are out or whatever, like, but it's still essentially the same thing. They
Mm-hmm.
don't really know about that change that occurred, that it basically was paralleling the secular music scene. And
Mm-hmm.
so we do know that this change that occurred is primarily for being relevant, or, I get, we'll put it like this. We've kept the message the same, but we've changed the delivery.
Mm-hmm.
We've contextualized it to reach this culture, because this is what is going to reach this culture. We know that the culture likes concerts, likes this type of music. That's why it sells so much. That's why
Mm-hmm.
it's so listened to. Like, why not make that about Christ
Mm-hmm.
in that certain delivery? Why not that? Like, is that a bad motivation, wanting to
Mm-hmm.
reach the lost?
Yeah. I mean, I know if that's the only motivation,
All right,
which,
great. Let's move on.
yeah, which I think, which you mentioned earlier. I don't know if it was when we were recording or not, but CCM and how it's not motivated by just delivering the message specifically. And it's not just about reaching the lost. There is profit involved. And that's where you get and I'm not saying anything negative about the groups themselves. I'm just going to list them, but you have Hillsong United, you have Bethel Worship, you have Bethel Music, and you have Elevation Worship, and then other churches that are lower lying that are trying to be like them, that put out their kind of their own music and things like that. But I think it's safe to say those are the big three, right? So many churches not steal, but they license their music and use them, and they get money through that and things like
Yeah,
that.
those are definitely some of the heavy hitters, sure.
Yeah, and you hear those music, you hear those songs that are played on the radio now, or I'm sorry, sorry, you hear those songs that are played in a church setting, now they're on the radio, and they're available for purchase on iTunes, and they're available on Spotify and Apple Music, not just iTunes, but things like that too. So it's really these churches and then other people that kind of break off from just a worship group. Chris Tomlin is a big example, who kind of ghost writes for other people, puts out his own music. But these people that kind of that they just self-identify as Christians and just blow up, you know, that way. And you have different genres of different artists that do the same thing, whether it's rap or rock or soft rock, electronic, and some people are in a Christian group, but then they go off and they write secular music.
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind, if we're talking about the worship service on a Sunday, is that, yeah, the fact that the songs that you're choosing from, so many of them are published by four profit, like record labels.
Yeah.
And if you do have a for profit business, it is true that they cannot solely be motivated by glorifying God.
Hmm.
But presumably that's what our sole motivation is, hopefully, for the
Hmm.
Sunday morning and why we're choosing what we're choosing. And I know obviously a lot of it is what are the people going to like, what's going to get them into it. And, there are these other motivations as well. But like if our main thing is to glorify God, but
Hmm.
we're picking from these options that are very heavily motivated by money,
Hmm.
and it's
It's like a
problematic. It's
yeah.
not like you can't use the songs, but it just has to be taken into consideration.
It's almost like there's a Bible verse about serving God and serving money and
Yeah.
how well that works out.
Yeah. No, I
What?
know.
What?
It's it's a tough thing. It's a tough situation.
Mm.
I mean, I've changed so much on this. And I mean, it was kind of like a long time
Hmm.
coming, and it's just that Christian music, or what we know as Christian music, is a fine thing. It's great. I'm glad that it exists. But should it have like what we currently know as Christian music, the parallel to the secular music scene that's instead focused on Jesus lyrically,
Hmm.
is that is that something that should have taken over the Sunday morning Christian
Sure.
worship service?
Yeah.
And
And
for me, it's a no.
yeah, it's for me it's hard to answer simply because I think if it hadn't and we didn't know any different, either there'd be less people in church because people didn't like the music, or that would just still be the way it is. So, as I mentioned, when I was real young and they were singing 90s music, which wasn't old at the time because it's early 2000s that I was that young. I didn't know any different at that point, and if they had sung hymns, I wouldn't have known any different.
Yeah.
So it is kind of this move into, like you said, the parallels. Oh, we're gonna be a rockin' church, and we're gonna break out the guitars because we're real people or something. And yeah, I guess it's just difficult because being in the setting that I've been in now, it just feels so much more real and so much more raw to me when the whole church is united in singing something.
Oh, sure. And to me also, it's not so much even just the songs themselves, but the shape of the service
Hmm.
and the feel, the atmosphere of it. So for instance, let's say there was a church that's liturgical and it basically does the liturgy every week, but let's say the four different spots where they have songs, one or two of them are hymns,
Hmm.
and then the other two are more modern, contemporary
Sure.
Christian songs. And maybe they even have someone with an acoustic guitar standing next to the piano
Hmm.
during those songs. I have no issue with that at all.
Hmm.
It's more just it's a concert,
Yeah, it's the
you
focus
know?
on it.
Yeah. And definitely, because even, in a liturgical church, you have the front, which is technically the front area behind the rail is the sanctuary. The part
Hmm.
where the parishioners are seated is the nave, and which is cool. It comes from a word that means temple, but that's where the people sit, and then the sanctuary is up where the priest and the deacon and the choir might be seated up there, and
Hmm.
other ministers, people that are like carrying the cross or the thurifer, someone who's going to be like the censer.
Hmm.
But up there, that's where everyone's facing,
Hmm.
uh, and because the altar's there,
Yeah.
and that's where the Eucharist is done, and the hosts are consecrated, and and you're facing up there, and often there's like a big cross above it or something
Hmm.
like that. And then the individual playing the organ or the piano is over to the side.
Yeah.
And even the choir, you might have the choir up in the back behind you, or you might have the choir up front, but they're on the sides. And to me, it's just so, like the worship part of the contemporary evangelical service. You got a big old stage with spotlights on a bunch of people who are singing,
Hmm.
just like at a concert, and you're singing to God and you're staring at these people,
Yeah.
you know.
And they're looking back your way.
And yeah, and so and I know that different Anglican churches do it differently. Like some priests face the people the whole time,
Hmm.
but the traditional way is when you're addressing God, you actually face God. So the priest would turn and face the same way as the people,
Hmm.
and so like that's one thing that I love is like if we're singing. Our rector, our priest, he's not looking at us. He's facing the same way, and we're all like
Yeah.
facing God, you know.
Hmm.
And I'm not staring at his face. Uh, or anybody's, you know.
Yeah.
And obviously you could have your eyes closed, but I really didn't like staring at people while I'm singing Jesus, and we're meant to stare at them because the spotlight's on them,
Yeah.
and they're looking out at us like it's a concert.
Yeah. It's not unintentional.
I don't think a lot of people think through this. I don't think a lot of church leaders really think through,
Hmm.
like, is it a good thing? What if we just took the stage and just put like have it be concerty, but stick them over to the side or something? What
Hmm.
if you just did that? You know, the preacher, obviously, you're going to look at the person while he's preaching.
Yeah.
Clearly.
I would say it's not those changes, like you mentioned, are they happen over time, but they're also just not intentional or they're not thought through. And
Yeah.
I think if I had if I mentioned, because I have friends that go to different churches that are in,
What?
sorry, that but no, they're in different positions of power, and when if they heard what you said and broke it down and really, the thing too is it's so easy to write off when you, I've been written off more than I think I've been really listened to ever since leaving the contemporary evangelical church and going into a more traditional, old school high church. I really do think that. And but I think if they took the time to consider why is it that I'm in this position, I could potentially make a change in this way, but why is it that I'm not? Why is it that I'm allowing people to face me the same way that the same way Celine Dion gets stared at, the same way Cardi B gets stared at, to be contemporary.
You mean why you're choosing not to
Yeah, why
worship
not?
that way?
Yeah, exactly. Because people just think, well, that's the way it is because I got saved in this church, because I got emotional in this church. And yeah, it's just the music becomes the focal point. And so then the worship team thinks because, I did it. There we go. The worship team. The music team. No, the music team thinks that they're the focal point, but they're not. God is the focal point. And by standing there, whether or not your church has a cross, whether or not it does look like a concert hall or not, but the focal point, you should have a focal point, in my opinion, that's about God, because the worship service is about God. And we've talked on this podcast about not being against Christian concerts. So it's not speaking against the people that are playing the music. It's the context that you are playing, because I think that's really the only time that the music is Christian.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about, can music be Christian and things like that. But
Yeah.
when you have a group of people that are doing the praise music, the worship music, yeah, should it really be all eyes on them? And I would say no. I would say that I really got used to that, and I
Sure.
I haven't thought it through as much as you have by any means, but even just you posing the question now, and I'm thinking, yeah, that's really poor planning. That's just, yeah, that's the wrong, I think it's the wrong way to focus. The same with a preacher, again, being front and center, because it's just not about us. It's not about the worshiper, and it's not about the one who's leading the worship, and I mean worship fully, not just the music, but it's
Sure.
not just about a priest or pastor or the group or the people in the crowd. And it never has been about those people. It's always been about giving the glory to God. So why aren't we making those moves to do so? I mean, I go to a different church, so I did kind of make a move, but just the people within power.
Yeah, and two things. One is that it's reminding me of I've read many books that just describe different revivals that occurred,
Mm-hmm.
and it reminds me of at the Azusa Street revival. The man who led that, this was in 1906. It started in Southern California. William Seymour. He was very concerned. He seemed like a very holy man and was concerned about not like stealing glory from God. And this may seem a little extreme, but I always remember this part where it talked about there would be many times when if he was in front praying, he would like stick his head in a box so that people couldn't look at him. And it seems weird, and there's probably more context to it that I can't remember, but I just remember that visual. Like, he really didn't want people like looking at him and focusing on him. And so anyway, but then also I think Evan Roberts, I believe that's his name. It's been a while since I've read these. There was the Welsh revival, which was just before the Azusa Street revival. I believe it was in 1904, maybe into 1905, and the Spirit broke out, and this man was leading like revival services that really they weren't much more than just prayer. And
Mm-hmm.
he would just sit there and just kind of rock back and forth and just pray and cry out to the Lord. He was a very, very intense individual. But there would be nobody on the stage. He'd be sitting like in the front pew with other people, just sitting there, just praying. And people were being struck by the Lord spontaneously and were just like dropping to their knees and confessing their sins and just really crazy stuff. But
And there was no keyboards going on?
not that I know of.
That's weird.
I know. Now, when you were talking more about the eyes on the music team, right? It made me think of this illustration that a priest had told me, which I've told you before. And what's so funny is I'm trying to think, have I actually said this on the podcast before? I may have, like, it's so funny. Have we gotten to the point where I'm going to start repeating myself and not even know it? It may be, but it's a really good illustration. So
Sure.
I'm gonna bring it up again. If you've heard it, pretend that you haven't, Mom. Okay, thanks. And so, and this was from a man named Father Jerry, actually the guy whose church I first went to, an Anglican church, the first time that we went back in Spokane for a couple of years when we were in Bible college. And he was a former evangelical church planter. I mean, he's still evangelical, but he was a church planter in just like the evangelical church, and then ended up becoming Anglican. And this was one of the things that really hit home for him concerning the worship and the focus of the worship. And he takes this analogy. I think it's from Soren Kierkegaard, but it's basically this: that you have kind of three actors, let's say, or players in the worship scene. And so you've got God, you've got the ministers, and then you've got the people, the congregation. And so in the average evangelical scenario, what you have is God, who is the director. It's almost like a theater scene, and it's God directing the ministers on stage. Let's say the musical performers, and the people of God, the congregation. They're the judges, and they judge it and decide whether it's good or not. And so the ministers are performing for their audience, for their judges, for their approval. And that's not how it should be. How the worship service actually is designed and how God wants it to be is that the ministers are the directors, so to speak, of the people who are performing in a sense. They're lifting up their voices, or the liturgy. It's the entirety of that worship service. They're lifting up their praise unto the Lord, who is the judge. And so the ministers are directing the people in lifting up this praise and bringing before him this worship, this sacrifice of praise, seeking his approval. And that's ultimately what we should be asking is, what does God think about this? Does it matter at all what the people in the pews think? Yes, it does. That is true. But by and large, it so much more so needs to be, what does God think of what we're doing?